today our colleague and friend, Silvana Blazhevska, is going to talk about the burial practices at the Roman and late Roman necropolis of Stobi. If she allows me, I would like to present her very briefly. So it happens that we know each other already over 13 or 14 years. This was the first time when I went to Stobi. So Silvana is the founder of the National Institution of Stobi. She is the former director until 2017. And her research interests went and are much beyond Stobi, practically. She deals with pleasure with pre-Roman archaeology, but since she started working at Stobi, she deepened her interests into the Roman archaeology and also in the late Roman period as well. So I would like to give her the floor right now. And after the presentation, as most of you probably know, you have the chance to give your questions in the chat. So I will read it, and Silvana will respond to them. Please, Silvana, go ahead.
Thank you, Angela. Please let me at the beginning to express my gratitude to Balkan Heritage Foundation and New Bulgarian University for the invitation to present a lecture related to the archaeological site of Stobi within this very interesting series of online seminars, Balkan and Eastern Mediterranean archaeology. Yes, in fact, my interest was never Roman and late antique periods until I came to Stobi. Before that, I dealt with late archaic to end of late Hellenistic periods. But since I came to Stobi and start conducting huge excavations, especially 2009 and 10, and since I'm working there as a senior curator of for stone monuments, then my interest turned to Roman and late antique periods. I believe that most of you are familiar with the history, archaeology, and the discovered monuments of Stobi, but for those who are not, let me just briefly introduce you to the site. The ancient city of Stobi is located in the northern part of the Roman province of Macedonia, modern day Republic of North Macedonia, right in the middle. It is located at the confluence of two largest rivers, Axios, Vardar, and Erigon Crna River. Also at intersection of two major roads in the known since the prehistoric periods, the one that goes from Thessaloniki, from south towards north from Thessaloniki through Piana, Nisus, Viminatium, and Sigidunum, and the second road to the branch of famous Via Egnatia at Heraclea Linkestis and through Stobi leads to Pautalia and Serdica. The major chronological frames of the archaeological site of Stobi are late 3rd century to late 6th or early 7th century CE. The ruins of the ancient city of Stobi were located for the first time in the mid-19th century. The first excavation started during the First World War, and they're still ongoing. The city spreads over three terraces going sloping gradually towards the bank of the river Crna. This is the upper terrace, the middle, and the lower terrace. The first records about the city are by the Roman historian Livy, who referred to the event in the early 2nd century BC and called the city Urbs Vetus, or Old City. When Romans conquered the ancient Macedonian kingdom and divided into four districts, so Stobi belonged to the fourth district and became a major trade center for salt towards north or towards Dardania. During in the Augustan period, Pliny referred to the city as Oppidum Civium Romanorum. Perhaps at the same time or slightly later, it became a municipium of citizens who were granted with ius italicum, and also Municipium Stobensium was recorded on a few inscriptions and imperial mints or coins minted between the time in the period between Vespasian and Caracalla. During the late antiquity, it became an important early Christian center, important episcopal see, for a short period of time, a capital city of the newly established province of Macedonia Secunda. And finally, the city was abandoned at the end of the 6th or early 7th century. This is the ground plan of Stobi, and as I mentioned, the city spread on 3 terraces, and the middle terrace is the most excavated. Most of the late antique buildings are located here: churches, public baths, private residences. Early Roman synagogue and house of Polyharmos, the theater, the temple of Isis building with arches, and Casa Romana were located on partially on the middle and lower terrace. Well, this strategic position was foreseen by the Romans, and the Stobi really during the Augustan period enlarged its territory, and it has many rises and declines, which were influenced by various causes, events, and individuals, private individuals, emperors, prominent citizens, bishops, and also various natural disasters and warfares, which actually shaped the urban layout of the city. We can divide several periods of its urban development. The first during the time of Augustus, the second in the 2nd century, when the major public buildings, were erected. On this slide, you see the theater, the temple of Isis, and the building with arches. And the transitional 4th century and also 5th and 6th centuries, when the city was largely influenced by the Christianity. Most of the private residences were built in the 4th century. The first episcopal basilica was built at the end of the 4th or beginning of the 5th century. The other churches in the city, 5 total in number, were erected in the time between the mid of 5th and late 5th or early 6th century. But the city finally was, as I mentioned before, abandoned in the late 6th or early 7th century. But the focus of this lecture is not the city itself, but the cemeteries of Stobi. They were located on different locations inside and outside the city. The earliest Hellenistic cemetery located on below the house of Peristeria and Domus Fulonica, dated to the late third from the late 3rd to the late 2nd century BC. Then the West Cemetery, the largest of the Stobi cemeteries, the Northwest Cemetery, which is late antique, 5th and 6th century perhaps. Another 4th century, small 4th century cemetery located within the city above the ruins of the building with arches, and Northeast Cemetery. But the topic about the Stobi cemetery is huge. The number of the so far discovered graves is 2,840. That's why we can go into details of each of the cemetery in each period of existence of the city. But this lecture was intended to give just an overview of the cemeteries and burial customs of the ancient Stobenses, using mainly the information from the latest excavations at Stobi in the past decade. Especially because we can't use much of the previous excavation from the excavation at the cemetery basilica during the First World War. The documentation is lost. Most of the documentation from the salvage excavation of in 1978, 1992, and 1995 at the West Cemetery is kept in the National Conservation Center. Most of the documentation of the 4th century cemetery discovered above the building with arches is in the Museum of Macedonia, so we don't have the all information about all details about the cemeteries discovered within and outside of the city walls of Stobi. But we will start with the Hellenistic cemetery. As I mentioned before, Livy mentioned the old city of Stobi in the early 2nd century BC, when the city probably occupied a small area at the northwest part of the upper terrace. Not much of the Hellenistic city was discovered, but below the house of Peristeria and Domus Pholonica, a few graves dating from the Hellenistic period were uncovered. The excavations were carried out in 1965, 1970, and 1970s and 2011. And the total number of 15 burials dated from the late 3rd to the end of the 2nd century were discovered. 13 of those were discovered below the house of Peristeria, 2 below Domus Pholonica, and 1 single grave was reported in the orchestra of the theater, dated to the Hellenistic period, mainly due to the stratigraphic position. Also, during the excavation in 2001, there was a report of additional 13 graves, but the outer in the area inside of the city, below Domus Pholonica and Peristeria. But since the authors or the excavators did not provide any evidence for graves, we actually we can express doubts that they were graves. This is the plan of the house of Peristeria, and with crosses that mark the discovered graves below the house of Peristeria. They differ in ritual, grave construction, orientation, type, and quantity of the offerings. This is the Hellenistic graves discovered so far within the city were published in Studies Volume number 4, where with my colleague Goce Pavlovsky, we gave this table with statistic of the Hellenistic graves discovered in Stobi. Total number of those are 15. As I said, 13 below the peristeria house, 2 below the Domus Polonica, of which 10 are inhumated burials, 5 are cremations. Cyst graves are only 3. Most of them are simple pit graves, and only one is urn. They're differently oriented. Only for a few we have gender and age. Some of them have coins deposited as a grave offering, and they generally date between the late 3rd and late 2nd century BC. These are the images of some of the new graves discovered in 2011 below the house of Peristeria. Inhumated burials in a simple cyst delineated with mud bricks, and a child burial in a cyst grave made of large sandstone slabs, with a lot of grave offerings, a lot of terracotta figurines, knuckle bones, while the rest of the graves that belong to the Hellenistic cemetery contain only 1 or 2 finds, mainly oil lamps, small fusiform inventaria. This is the first grave discovered by Mikulčić. And the earliest grave in the Hellenistic cemetery with Westlow pyxis used as a burial offering. 2 other graves that were discovered in below the house or below Domus Polonica. One is a cyst grave, and it's very both of them were dated in the published reports in the 2nd century BC. But one recent discussion with a colleague from Museum of Macedonia, who is dealing with the late Bronze Age cemetery of nearby village of Ulanci, suggested that maybe grave 312, which has necklace made of beads and shells, perhaps belong to much earlier grave. Maybe now is the time to mention that finds from the prehistoric periods were discovered throughout the Stobi outside of dated context. And most of them are interpreted as finds from disturbed graves that belong to the late Bronze Age, such as mud-painted cantery found at the West Cemetery, or bronze pendants that belong to the Paeonian or so-called Paeonian or Macedonian bronzes, which date throughout the Iron Age and late Archaic period. So maybe this idea of colleague Zlatko Videvski that this is not the 2nd century offering, but much earlier, should be considered as well. This is the only grave discovered within the latest excavations at the Hellenistic cemetery at Stobi. That is a simple pit delineated with the mud bricks and cremated, full with a ceramic vessel, various ceramic vessels typical for the late 2nd century BC. Well, in this paper, we are discussing also the previous discovered graves. Among them, there is one grave in urn explained or published by Victoria Sokolovska and dated in the 1st century BC. We think that this is not a burial, and for many various reasons, she did not explain that bones found inside the urn belong to a human or animal, and plus the date of the urn in the late 1st century is too late because the Roman during the Augustan period, the town spread significantly. The territory of the town spread significantly. So the cemetery from the Augustan period was moved outside the city walls at the West Cemetery. The West Cemetery of Stobi spread towards southwest and the village of Palikuram, but we will almost 2 kilometers. But we will discuss mainly this part which is closest to Porta Heraclea Gate and to the cemetery basilica. Most of the graves of the total number of 2,840 were discovered at the West Cemetery, although it is possible that some of the previous season excavations, some of the grave numbers are overlapping. There are few large excavations at the West Cemetery. First, in 1965, Ivan Mikulčić excavated dozens of graves along the local railroad. Then in the 1970s, during the large Stobi project, Alvis Solovsky discovered around more than 300 graves near the Porta Heraclea. Then the large salvage excavation in 1992 and 1995 were located on the place where later the major highway was excavated, and the National Institution Stobi started huge excavations, large-scale excavation at the West Cemetery in 2009 and 2010, and they continue until the latest were, I think, at 2020. This is the trench of the Stobi project, and our large excavation project was conducted around this trench. We have also around 300 graves discovered at the West Cemetery. This is the overview of the some of the graves that were excavated in 2009 at the West Cemetery at Stobi. In general, we completely agree with the grave types explained by Alvis Solovsky in Studies in the Antiquities of Stobi, Volume 2, where he gave a summary of the grave they discovered at the West Cemetery. It is obviously the cremation, both rituals are recorded, cremation and inhumation. There are different grave forms which were explained by Veselovsky, and we can only add a few more types. Among the cremations, there are different variations of grave forms with or without tiles. simple over or rectangular pit, urn burials, double pit cremation, arch style, box style, mud brick construction, and stone built construction for multiple burials are something which is new at the West Cemetery, discovered during the excavation 2009 and 10. And also inhumated burials are mainly the same types, the same type that Alves Solovsky already recorded. Also about, we completely agree about the chronology that he proposed for the West Cemetery, that there are 5 large periods of burials at the West Cemetery, starting from the early Augustan period, ending with the 4th century, which is period of 5. Early Augustan period, we also recorded during the Augustan period, we also recorded two levels of burials, not buried in a large time span. They date from the late 1st century to early 1st century BC to early 1st century CE. Also, I should mention the proposal of Anderson Stojanovic for a new chronology at the West Cemetery. She divided 7 phases, with her first phase starting at 150 BC, but ending in the Augustan period at the turn of old to a new era. But the problem is that she dates the earliest graves to the mid-2nd century based on few ceramic pots which are discovered within the graves. But Stobi Cemetery, especially ceramic grave offerings, are known and well explained by Anderson Stojanovic that appear later than in the other part of the Roman province of Macedonia, such is the case with the fusiform inventaria. So we believe that these few ceramic vessels that she dated so early actually are survivals of the earlier Hellenistic shapes. During our excavation at the West Cemetery, there are no finds earlier than late 1st century BC or the Augustan period. We all agree that the burials at the West Cemetery end around 400 CE. These are some of the different types of cremation burials dated in the Augustan period, discovered during the 2009 and 2010. So we have a simple pit with scorched walls, backfilled with just dirt. This is the famous grave 2226, where 116 terracotta figurines were discovered placed in the middle of the grave. Then we have different other types of oval or rectangular, deep or shallow pits with scorched walls, where with few or many grave offerings. Some of them were covered with mud bricks. There are also examples of multiple burials within the same grave, such is the case with this grave, where we have the large simple pit with primary burial, and the secondary burial is placed at the end in the ceramic container. Then we have the simple pits with arch-styled grave inside. Sometimes the cremated remains and or offerings were placed inside the arch-styled construction or additionally in another ceramic container. Then we have the same type as discovered before. Many of the graves arch style or simple pits were surrounded by peribolous wall. This is the case where we have the peribolous wall, arch style grave, and ceramic containers inside the grave. And this is the very interesting grave, which is only a peribolous, a simple pit surrounded by peribolous wall, and many finds which I will show later in the slide. It's an unusual grave regarding the grave offerings. New type of grave construction is, at least I'm not familiar with the previous excavations that this type of grave was discovered. Perhaps a rescue excavation 1992 or 1995 can supplement our knowledge. This is a huge mud brick grave. Mud bricks were lined in a rectangular shapes, and plus the grave was covered with mud bricks. The inside is scorched. It seems like maybe the cremation occurred here, maybe on a different place, but still at least the scorched bottom and walls point perhaps same as in the other cremated burials with a simple pits with the scorched walls, that perhaps purification over the grave fire occurred within the grave pit. Then there are few other types as explained by Veselovsky with additional features. There are small box type burials created either with stones or with tiles. There are ceramic tubes placed as libation tubes. There are also double pits framed with a circular ring of stones, like this case, like the case of this grave belonging in the late first century AD. And also another new type of burials are actually the type of grave construction are similar as the previous variation, with the exception that they were placed within a built stone and mortar built construction. We have two constructions like that of this type discovered so far. One has a semicircular shape and has three burials inside. The primary burial, which is a simple pit, then another burial within, which is the arch style construction, and plus two burials in urn or a ceramic container. Additionally, here you can notice the libation tube. The second is much larger. It has unusual, irregular rectangular shape, and has it's separated in several different chambers. Let's call them chambers. There are multiple there are single burials, simple cyst, arch style graves, and there are also multiple burials within a single grave, such as this case, where we have cremation within the cyst, and then two other containers. One is a lead urn, and the other is ceramic. Actually, two ceramic pots and one a lead vessel that contain also cremated remains of deceased. Some of the graves, cremated graves, were full with finds, and mostly ceramic vessels of different types. The most frequent are different type of ungventarium. Also, some of the Hellenistic shapes are present, like this stammet pyxis or this flask. Very interesting finds are this small amphora made of alabaster amphoras. I mentioned before the huge, the grave that contained the largest number of terracotta figurines, total number of 115 or 116, placed in the middle of the simple grave pit. Then various types of cups or plates, which are simple ceramic plates, which date in the 1st and the 2nd century AD. Then metal finds are not that frequent. There are few strigili, few jewelry objects, ceramic oil lamps, also various gaming pieces. And this is that the finds that were found in that grave, which is usual by its grave construction, unusual by the grave offering, a simple pit surrounded by a peribolous wall, but with a lot of jewelry pieces inside, and fragments of marble statuettes. This one belongs to Aphrodite, and a small male head. We call this grave the lady, the grave of the lady. Cremation was a dominant ritual at the West Cemetery until perhaps AD 300. But since the second half of the 2nd century, inhumated burials were also there are a lot of inhumated burials in the previous period, except burials of the infants. When the cremation is dominated, still the infants were inhumated. Also, there are different types of grave construction of the inhumated, with the inhumated burials, simple rectangular or oval pits backfilled with earth. These 4 burials look like they were just thrown inside a simple pit. Arch-style graves, then a small box type of grave with for inhumated burials, such as this case where we have infant buried. Then built cyst, built of sandstones, bonded at the joints with the clay, or built of cyst of mud bricks and of bricks and mortar. What is noticeable is that the inhumated burials preserve organic material. usually pieces of cloth that was wrapped around the body, or sometimes even parts of the sandals or the shoes of the deceased. And in general, all the information that we found contained much less finds than the cremated burials. I would like to also to show you this very unusual grave, if we can say it's unusual in the frame of our excavation, maybe not unusual at the whole West Cemetery. It was a grave which is a multiple, which has multiple burials, exactly 4. Primary burial, which was quite early, perhaps 1st or 2nd century AD, and the later one were gathered at the end of the simple pit, and then the other 2 inhumations were placed in. The whole burial was covered with stone slabs, and on top of it there were remains of a ritual, commemoration ritual, or banquet over the grave, with 1 oil lamp placed on the top. As I mentioned, the earliest graves belong to probably early 2nd century AD, but the latest burials were dated to the late 3rd or early 4th century, judging by the glass vessel and the oil lamp which was placed on top of the grave. What I presented so far are burials at the West Cemetery from the Augustan period until the 4th century. And as we can see, they're simple type of, although there are many huge variation of grave forms and a lot of grave offerings, still we can say that probably this is the part of the cemetery where the local population was buried. What is noticeable is a lack of sarcophagi or lavish Roman burials, which probably we should look for it on a different location. But on this slide, I want to show you some example of a sarcophagi, which confirms that there are sarcophagi burials at Stobi. These 2 marble slabs were discovered reused at the casino as a parapet on the pool in the peristyle court. But both of them actually are back or front side of an early Roman sarcophagi, probably dated in the late 1st, early 2nd century AD, made of Pantelic marble and typical for Attic sarcophagi of this period. Also, there are a few small ossuaria discovered at Stobi. The one is presented on this slide, but we don't have much information about the context of their discovery, since the documentation is still in National Conservation Center. And also, I want to show you one very lavishly decorated grave. It happened that I have this photograph of the 1995 excavation, because we found the frescoes which decorated the side walls of the grave in 2009, and when they went under conservation. Probably the grave date in the late 3rd or early 4th century, and It's one of the lavish or more rich burial dated in the late antiquity discovered at the West Cemetery. After the 4th century, a large suburb was erected above the cemetery. And in the following period, during the late antiquity, the cemetery, the burial ground was located around the cemetery basilica and closer to the fortification walls. The excavation at the cemetery basilica, as I mentioned, were conducted during the First World War. There is no documentation preserved from the excavation. Maybe somebody who is dealing more with the late antiquity can tell more about the graves discovered at the cemetery basilica. We have here the plan of the basilica and the graves discovered within the narthex, the nave, really clear the area of the cemetery basilica in 2009, and this is the poor condition that we discovered. Still, the vaulted tombs the vaulted tombs are still there, and on some of them the paintings are still preserved on the walls. Actually, the cemetery basilica dates from the mid-5th century, when all the graves were concentrated around it. Perhaps later in the 5th and throughout the 6th century, the most of the graves were concentrated along the fortification walls. This is the northwest cemetery in 2009 and 10. Northwest fortification wall was uncovered in a length of 325 meters with 5 towers, and most of the graves were concentrated in the northwest part between the 3rd and the 5th tower. There are different, also again, different grave forms at the Northwest Cemetery, mainly arch-style graves. There are burials of adults, but most of them belong to the small children and infants. This is the slide shows the various types of grave forms at the Northwest Cemetery. Arch-style or cyst or graves are made of stone slabs, or just simple pits. Many of these burials had a secondary burial, with the primary burial gathered at the end of the grave. At the end of the grave, but also there are double burials or burials that occurred at the same time, probably of family or closely related people. Here also we have good preservation of organic material, shoes or parts of the clothes or the cloth that covered the deceased. And unfortunately, very few fine grave offerings, mainly necklaces of glass and ivory, not ivory, bone comb, hair combs. I would like to turn attention to a few peculiarities at Stobi. The one is the late 4th century burials discovered above the ruins of the building with arches. Most of them are arch-style graves. Some are simple pits, and only one is a circular grave delineated with stones. The colleagues discovered a total number of 50 graves within the small cemetery. But with not many finds within the graves, but they were buried in a deposit in a layer that consists a lot of pottery fragments, a lot of bone hairpins. But inside the graves, there are many coins which date the latest burial in the time of Valens in the 3rd quarter of the 4th century. It's interesting that the small cemetery is located only above the large hall of the building with arches, and it doesn't spread towards east or on the other side of the inner fortification wall, which was, as we know, as we assume, built later perhaps in the beginning of the 5th or towards the mid-5th century AD. These are the images of the graves discovered intramural above the building with arches. You can see the different types, and this the only circular grave. And I would like to mention another intramural burial, which is it's a vaulted tomb discovered in the south aisle of the Episcopal Basilica. The assumption is that some of the bishops is buried here. Not much finds, but again, the sandals of the bishop of the deceased were still preserved. The grave probably dates between the 1st and the 2nd phase of the large basilica, or it obviously destroyed the mosaic floor of the 1st phase of the basilica, so it's built later, probably during the 2nd phase of the large episcopal basilica or the basilica on the terrace. Also, there are few burials discovered within the 6th century houses or buildings at Stobi. Most of them, again, belong to small children or infants. Most of them were buried below the floors. They're simple of the houses. They're simple pits covered with a single tile or completely uncovered, such is the case with this infant buried in the house, so-called house of the triclinium, perhaps in the 1st half of the 6th century. This one is found in between the radial walls of the theater, below the floor level of the later late antique houses built there. This is also at the discovered at the residential and commercial quarter in the context of the late 6th century, and only this built grave, built of tiles, double burial, is discovered near the Temple of Isis. In the latest strata or latest deposits that might be related to medieval period. As you know, there are, as I mentioned before, there is a small medieval cemetery discovered above the civil and above the civil basilica. Graves were published by Blaga Alexova in one of the studies volumes. I will not discuss any of these medieval burials, except that They might belong to the small settlement at Stobi, which is confirmed from the medieval period, which was confirmed late with the latest excavations near the inner east fortification wall and above the Temple of Isis, in between the radial walls of the theater. So this small cemetery might belong to these people who established this small settlement, medieval settlement at Stobi. So I maybe just went briefly through the cemeteries and burial customs at Stobi, just to give you an overview. If I can explain anything more in detail, please. I'm expecting your questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Silvana, for this very interesting and informative presentation, summarizing the results of excavations which lasted so many years. So now I would like to, actually we already have the first question, and everyone is invited to put their question in the chat. So the first one by Carol Schneier: why were oil lamps deposited in Hellenistic graves?
Why just in Hellenistic? They're not just in Hellenistic graves. They're found in even in later Roman graves. Our professor Ivan Mikucic, who teach the class of classical and Roman archaeology, like to make a story to make the things more interested for the students, and the idea of lightening the light above the grave, it's not just in the antiquity, it's even today, but we don't light oil lamps today, we light candles. And his theory, or many, not just his, but many theory of or explanation of other people, is that for the first 40 days, the soul of the deceased should be around the grave. It's not just the Hellenistic custom.
Okay, thank you. So the next question by Felice: why was the city abandoned?
Oh, many reasons. 6th century was very interesting from the point of view of the events that occurred at Stobi. There was an earthquake early in the 6th century. Then probably the whole empire suffered the bubonic plague during the time of Justinian. Then there were raids by the Avar and Slavs in the second half of the 6th century. General decline of the economic prosperity in the second half of the 6th century caused by barbaric intrusions. And finally, there is an opinion that there were huge climate changes that happened at the end of the 6th century. Also, there are also evidence for another earthquake that struck the city at the end of the 6th century or beginning of the 7th. And that's the case not just with Stobi, but with many others late antique cities in the province, in this part of the world, not just province of Macedonia or Secunda.
Okay, thank you. So the next one by Caroline Downing: can any subjects' images be identified in the painted tombs?
Can any, sorry, can you repeat the question?
Can any subjects' images be identified in the painted tombs?
Oh, the painted tombs. Unfortunately, we don't have the whole documentation, but We found two painted side walls on two stone and mortar built graves. Both are discovered 1995. On one, you can see the image. You can see the inscription on the one that I show, Hobios Oblektos, or the life that I saw, that I'm seeing in translation. No other image except for imitation of marble incrustation, very similar as the lower zone of the early church. And I think that one long side of this grave with the inscription has also some floral or geometric images, but nothing specific.
Well, the next question is by our colleague Bogdan Atanasov. Thank you for the presentation of this huge and quite important archaeological site. As a prehistorian, I am very impressed by the animal figures in a Roman time grave. Can you tell us something more about the interpretation about these animal figurines? Are they common? Do you find them in non-funeral contexts? What animals are presented?
Yeah, I guess he thinks on terracotta figurines.
Yes.
No, they're not found outside the grave context. Mainly they're, as you can see here, there are images of Telesphorus or different other deities of the Greco-Roman pantheon. There are images of youth on seated on bull, images of Aphrodite, Eros and Psyche, different types of eroti, different types of theater actors, but animals, only bulls, ram, and dogs. And this horse is interpreted as a child toy. They're not, as I mentioned, they're not found outside the burial context at Stobi. We don't have remains of the Hellenistic settlement to see if they had any role in the everyday life. Even their role in the burial is discussed lately by Anderson Stojanovic, and she has a really interesting theory that the figurines were just something that were that people bought near the cemetery to put as an offering inside the graves. There are different opinions about the role of the figurines inside the burials, especially of those who are images of various deities. Maybe their role is not just that simple, just as an offering to the deceased. But this animal, or actually not just the animal, all the terracotta figurines are placed in as a grave offerings in the burials at the West Cemetery, even in the Hellenistic cemetery for a short period. 2nd century BC to mostly the late 1st century AD, not before, not later.
Okay, so thank you for that response. And then we continue with Matthew Schuller and his question. Thank you for your talk, Silvana. Have any excavations being conducted on the other side of the Trna River, near the ruins on the bridge that once spanned it? is there any reason to think that the cemetery might have been over there?
On the other side of Crna River.
Yes.
Well, there are finds over there. Maybe Caroline Snively can answer this question better than me. There is, I think that I marked on the plan the existence of Northeast Cemetery, which is on the other side of Crna River and below the hill called Orlova Čuka, and on the plateau to the east of Orlova Čuka. And there are some evidence of burials discovered in this area. We know also that there was a basilica discovered in that area, also called Trans-Erigon Basilica, which the remains of which does not exist today. But nothing specific about this. Maybe somebody should dig in the documentation at Stobi, and the various notebooks can tell us more about this cemetery. If there is a cemetery, I assume it might be related to the late antiquity, it might be dated to the late antiquity and related to the basilica. I'm seeing Caroline, maybe she can.
Some burials were found on Orlova Čuka, I think back in the early 70s, the early 1970s. And at least one inscription. So I think they were Roman, but I don't remember any details. It's been a long time.
Yeah, they're never published, right?
I think maybe Jim Wiseman published one or more of the inscriptions, but I'm not absolutely certain about that. I think they were excavated by Vintage as salvage. And then, of course, as you mentioned, over around the Trans-Erigon Basilica, there apparently were burials, and the plateau that continues off to the east from Orlova Čuka apparently did have some burials on it, but the only evidence really was or were broken, what appeared to be broken grave slabs. So well, I think
if we're speaking about the broken grave slabs, other side of Vardar, on the other side of Vardar, where some assume that there is a second part of the city on the hill, there are many brick fragments, roof tile fragments of tiles, or fragments of slabs that might belong also to graves, but nobody excavated there.
I keep thinking that the Tito Velas Museum excavated over there at some point, but that's one of those bits of documentation that wherever it is, we don't have it. So
yeah. And these are
Carolyn, I have something to say about the graves on Orlova Čuka. Oh, yeah, let me.
Yes.
Yeah, but turn on my camera. There we go. That about 1974, there was an irrigation ditch that was dug with a mechanical bogger along the top of Orlova Čuka.
Yeah.
And about 110 graves were encountered. Some of them were constructed of brick. They were all subterranean, and they were salvaged or excavated by Joko Petoški. And he typed up a report that was maybe 80 pages long. Those graves were entered into the Stobi grave numbering system. And I have seen his typescript report either in Serbian or Macedonian. And has it shown up at Stobi somewhere?
Are you sure that that wasn't Sarjo Sarjovsky's report? I'm not sure. It's all been a long time ago.
Yes, yeah.
Well, we never found any report of Petachki on Orlova Chuka. There is a certain report or information in preliminary inventory book about the rescue excavations for the irrigation system, but near Palikura, not on Orlova Chuka, in 1978. And all the finds from those graves and the documentation were probably brought to the Archaeological Museum of Skopje, and we never received any information from them since.
It may have been was it Sarjo Carolyn was thinking about?
Sarge, okay, there were two salvage excavations in the 70s. There was one that Sarjo did sometime in the early 1970s. That was, it was an irrigation system out in the West Cemetery area. And then in 1970.
Oh, in the West Cemetery.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. And then in 1978, there was that big excavation for, what was it? The railroad that they, that went out to the nickel. The
Feni factory, right?
Sorry?
For the Feni factory railroad? Yeah, that was the nickel factory.
Yeah, it was in 1978, and I have illegal copies of some of the plans from it somewhere.
Unfortunately, we have only pieces of and fragments of documentation from the huge salvage excavation in 1992 and 1995 at the West Cemetery. They have probably the most interesting finds, graves, different, maybe additional different type of graves, additional information. Anyway, what you excavated, Al, and what we excavated at the West Cemetery is closer to the fortification wall and closer to Porta Heraclea, and this is the edge of the West Cemetery from the 1st to the 4th century. The major part probably was excavated during these rescue excavations, and it will be very interesting if we can gather all the information from the excavation of the West Cemetery, except those in the cemetery basilica. I don't think that there is any documentation regarding those excavations, and maybe did a huge good publication about the West Cemetery.
Well, what I will do is email Carolyn the recollection that I have.
Okay.
And then she can add to them with hers. And then send them to you, if that would be okay. Carolyn, would that be all right with you?
Yes, yes. Oh. And you know, I have that chapter that, you know, the chapter about graves and cemeteries at Stobi. So anything we can add to it, the better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Be happy to.
Yeah, great. Okay, we'd better let Silvana get back to the questions.
Yeah,
thank you for that discussion. And then the next question by Jeremy Ott. Why is there a high percentage of children by the city wall?
That's a very interesting question. And this, I think, Carolyn, if I'm right, you pointed to me the same situation near the fortification walls of the Thessalonica.
Yes, yes.
Where the cemeteries are going much closer to the fortification walls. Either we're talking about 6th century, probably the century which is not quite calm, or has many problems regarding intrusions, barbaric intrusions. So even the cemeteries are going closer to the city walls, and the large percentage of children burials speaks about the mortality rate of the children during the 6th century, for a reason which is unknown to me. Probably the anthropologist or can tell more about either this deaths, a high percentage of children burial are a result of a certain disease or something else.
Yeah.
Yes.
But that's the same situation in the 6th century burials inside the city. Children are buried below the floor levels within the houses.
Okay, so thank you for the response. And then I will continue with the next question by Carol Schneier. What is your interpretation of the double burial in the Temple of Isis?
Oh, near the Temple of Isis. Yes. There are no finds at all. It's a single burial in the whole area on the lower terrace. So this is the Temple of Isis and the whole complex around it. The temple was built in the 2nd century. There is a huge complex around, including this apsidal room, which also belonged to the 2nd century. But in the late 5th or early 5th century, late 4th or early 5th century, the whole complex around the temple was turned into residential area. This grave is found right near this apsidal building, and in much higher strata, which are related to the medieval, let's call it settlement, built above the ruins of the temple and the complex. So this grave does not have any finds which can help us date the grave, or except for its stratigraphic position. I believe it's medieval. And it's not unusual to have double burial of probably closely related people in the same burial pit, in the same grave construction.
There is another question which I missed again by Carol Schneier. What were knuckle bones used for in Hellenistic graves?
Knuckle bones. They're not just in Hellenistic graves, they're also present in the Augustan and early Roman graves. And there is a game played with knuckle bones in the antiquity. So that's why usually they're placed in children's graves.
Yes. Well, at the moment there is no other question, so I would like to encourage everyone who still have questions just to continue putting them in the chat. But in the meanwhile, if I may ask a question, did you find any stele, grave stele with inscriptions or any other signs on them, especially Hellenistic or in the later times?
No. We have grave stela at Stobi, especially grave stela related, dated in the from the late antiquity. But I have no information whether they were found, any of the stela in the depot were found in situ related to a certain burial.
See, so.
Carolyn, do you know of such case?
I don't think so. There were a couple of situations where there was a gravestone, and the assumption was that there was a grave underneath it, but they didn't find one. So
yeah, most of them are either secondary used somewhere else or just found at the surface. There are no, at least at the West Cemetery, there is no grave stela related to any burial from any period. And that's why we are very interested about finding the part of the cemetery where wealthy Romans were supposed to be buried in the marble sarcophagi or.
Yes, definitely. It will be very interesting. Carol Schneier has another question. Were any residues identified in the ceramic grave goods recovered from the West Necropolis?
I don't think that anybody did any analysis of the content inside the grave offerings, either they're ceramic vessels or glass vessels. I'm not familiar with that, with any analysis of this kind. There are many, maybe I forgot to mention, many nuts used as a grave, as part of the grave feast during the burial or after the burial during the commemoration. But considering the fact that there were commemorations and there was a burial feast during and slightly after the burial, that they might contain any different kind of foods that were offered, liquid or solid food that was offered to the deceased for the afterlife. But no scientifically proved analysis were made so far.
And were these nuts burnt when you found them, or?
Well, that's the some of them are, some of them are not, because they were not placed on
a plate.
On the sorry, my brain stopped. What's the name of the place where they cremated deceased outside of the grave? Pure. Never mind. Some of them are burnt just because most of the cremated simple pits burials at Stobi had grave fire inside the grave, and sometimes the surface was still hot when they placed the remains of the deceased, or when they placed the grave offerings. So they buried marks as they were burned, but they're not burned on the pure. They were burned just because they were placed shortly after the grave fire inside the grave.
See, okay. Okay, thank you for that. There is a comment by Dimitar Nikolovsky. There is a glass unguentarium from the excavations in 1992 with some red substance in it, but with no analysis, unfortunately. And then another question by Carol Schneier: why might some Hellenistic graves have tiles while others didn't? Was this possibly due to the cost of the grave?
Mud bricks is not something that costs a lot, so I'm not, I don't think that's the reason.
Okay, any other questions, anyone? Well, if not, I would like to thank Silvana once again for the wonderful Saturday evening. So thank you for this interesting presentation. It was a great summary of all the results, and I'm sure that you have much more to say. You still continue the research and the excavation, so hopefully some of the questions we still don't have answers, we'll find their answers with the next excavations. And I would like to invite everyone who is presenting to the presentation today to our next BEMA seminar, the last for this semester, on May 4th. The presentation will be given by Despina Tsiafaki, and it is going to be about Attic pottery in Thrace. So again, at the same time, the first Saturday in the month. Thank you very much, Silvana. So
thank you for listening this long presentation.
It was great. I found it very interesting, even though that I've been there. I've seen many of the things you showed, but it's still great to see everything at once. And I'm sure that I was not the only one who enjoyed it. So
thank you for your attention and interest and invitation again.
You're welcome.
And thank everybody for questions.
I'm also sure that when you meet our colleague Luba, who is an anthropologist, she will have many more questions to ask.
Maybe I should mention that most of the graves already has an anthropological analysis, but not published.
Yeah, see.
And there were many other research done on strontium analysis, or some other analysis were made on anthropological skeletal material, but again, nothing published.
Well, it will be interesting to learn more about the diet, about the diseases, of course, especially with this children mortality in the 6th century.
Well, Fanica Veljanovska, who is the only anthropologist that we have working in the Archaeological Museum, she did all the analysis of Stobi burials. And that will be a huge publication if we can make her to publish all the results that she has. Maybe she did publish here and there certain burials, but not all of them.
Let's hope that this will appear one day. It will be a great contribution because the number of the excavated graves is also impressive. So
yeah, if we can gather all the information from 1992 and 1995.
Is this the largest necropolis in North Macedonia studied up to the moment, or there are also other?
I think Skopje is also one of the largest, but that's different province, different burial rituals, different grave constructions.
Wow, interesting. Are you planning to publish some results also, right?
Hopefully.
And so are you going to excavate this year there again, or?
No. No. I think Dimitar Nikolovsky had the latest, the last excavations there to 2020. Dima?
Dime, okay.
Yeah, that's the last one. Yes, 2020.
Thank you for reminding me. I'm starting to forget things and seasons and what year, where we excavated. It's too much.
Yeah, it's too much. Yeah, he wrote here that Skopje has upwards of 5,000 excavated graves. Wow.
Still far less than Vibinatium with 18,000.
Oh, okay. It's impressive. You know, I've always thought that the necropolis of Apollonia Pontica has a very big number of excavated graves. They are probably about 3,000 right now, but still apparently Viminatium is another league. Yeah. Okay, so well, everyone is saying goodbye. Caroline, Matthew. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to say goodbye then in this case. And once again, thank you.